Hey everybody, and welcome to the 1044, a weekly webisode and podcast from the editors here at CCJ, Overdrive, and Truck Parts Service. I'm James Gillette, and my co-host on the other side is Jason Cannon, editor of CCJ. This week on the 1044, COVID-19 vaccine season is nigh, but can trucking capacity keep up? We'll explore what vaccine hauls have looked like so far from those with first-hand knowledge, and what the weeks ahead look like as tens of millions of more doses of vaccine are primed for distribution. Vaccines to protect against COVID-19 have been approved for administration in the U.S. for just a little over 2 months. And as we've explored a few times here on the podcast and on ccjdigital.com, guess what? They're moving by truck from point A to point B.
Yeah, and speaking of A to B, that's what our sources have said these loads look like. You're picking up at a shipper and hauling them to a distribution center. In a world where most loads are tracked and monitored already, the requirements there aren't too out of the ordinary for the carriers who have been tapped to haul them.
That seems to be one of the points of issue here, though, Jason, is that the pool of carriers chosen to haul vaccines is apparently pretty small. Single digits is my understanding, according to a few sources. And it's those carriers that have experience hauling high-priority pharmaceuticals and those who have been through a government vetting process for other loads or for contracts in the past. And that's a pretty small pool of carriers.
We talked to Chris Orban, the resident vaccine expert at telematics provider Trimble, about what he's seen on the COVID vaccine loads so far, how those hauls might change with the new vaccines coming to market, and how those supply chain might be able to keep up. What's been needed so far, he said, has been a highly syncopated dance between all parties involved, especially in the first few weeks of deployment between the police escorts and truckers hauling vaccine loads.
Right? I mean, like this is still picking something up from an origin and taking it to a destination. But the coordination is much more precise now. So we need to make sure that we are on schedule, that we don't have this load sitting in a holding area for too long, that we don't have, not just because of temperature controls, not just because of those kinds of things around Pfizer and Moderna, but because of the timeliness required. You know, if people are scheduled to get their second shot 3 weeks after the first one, what does you no good if that starts showing up either too early or too late? You know, we have to figure out how we're going to deal with this. So we're back to this whole concept of a connected supply chain and everything coming together to make sure the right product arrives at the right place at the right time for the right people. And I think that what we're seeing here is an advancement in tracking and coordination and just the sort of level of detail that's required to get this done, and a real, stepping up of the industry to do that sort of thing. Like when this was starting, every single load of vaccine was escorted. And again, imagine if you're a driver who's never had an escorted load before, well, that's a whole different ballgame, right?
More than one source we've spoken to, Chris included, said vaccine hauls have been isolated to just a few select carriers so far. Here's what Chris said about the profile those carriers must fit and why that might pose a logistics problem as vaccine load volume grows in the coming weeks and months.
I reached out to some of my contacts, primarily in the refrigerator space, even some of them who had hauled pharmaceuticals for some of these companies. And there was there was requirements around, have you done things like this before? Have you participated in high priority, pharmaceutical deliveries? And that's a small group. Like we don't actually deliver incredibly valuable pharmaceutical rollouts every day or every week or every month even. So there's a small group of carriers that are kind of queued up to do this and are trusted by both the government and the pharmaceutical companies and that sort of thing. And I think you're raising a really interesting point, which is what is the capacity of our system? Like what level of stress are we putting on the system here? The other thing that I think is important is some of my contacts, even though they had a security division and they were able to do escorted loads, didn't do them as a standard practice. So I think really that concentration on certain carriers was, have they done this before? Are we not going to overstress their system? Are we not going to overstress the drivers? I think there was some coordination there, which possibly slowed down the initial rollout, but I think, in general is the right way to do it. If you think about it, we're coming into what, mid-February here, and are we hitting a vaccine peak season like we just came off of a e-commerce peak season? We might well, and so then we just need more capacity in the system. And again, it's probably going to be carriers who have relationships with pharma companies, who have government contracts already, who have been through the vetting process. We don't have a lot of time to waste on this and to get more carriers into that population. So what's interesting for me is, yes, that capacity is going to be consumed by these hopefully easier to transport, still incredibly important to track and manage, but easier to transport vaccine doses. But then who's hauling other stuff? Like if a truck hauls vaccine that was not going to hauling vaccine last year, well, we know we haven't had more capacity added to the system, right? We didn't magically get more drivers into the system. So what load is either not getting hauled, or what opportunities are there for carriers who maybe can't play in the vaccine transport world? Do they get to pick up some of the slack from some of these guys who don't have the refrigerated capacity anymore to haul groceries or cosmetics or the other things like that?
Lastly, last week, the federal government said it had procured 200 million doses of vaccine for distribution. And Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health said that by April, many Americans who want the vaccine will be able to get one. We asked Chris whether logistically that's actually feasible and how those 200 million doses might fit into the ongoing work to move existing vaccine loads from A to B.
I trust what Dr. Fauci says, even if my logistics background says that's going to be a heck of a thing, right? I mean, so based on what he's saying, it will be a tremendous surge, and we will have a huge amount of capacity removed from the system for vaccine transport. If that's, I mean, let's say it's June. Let's say it's June when we start. Like that's still an incredibly tight timeline. You know, I mean, now we're looking at 4 months, and peak season is what, 2.5 months ish. You know, with obviously more freight, but less specialized freight, like less requirements around who can carry it. So we've got this smaller population of fleets and drivers and assets that can haul this. And how are we going to meet these numbers? My question would be, has anybody actually run the numbers? I don't know how many truckloads that would be. I don't know, we could figure out from the Pfizer data or from some of the Moderna existing shipments, but I don't know, like how many doses of AstraZeneca can you cram into a trailer? How many doses of Johnson & Johnson can you cram into a trailer? What's safe? What's not? What gets unloaded efficiently? I mean, God forbid you get this to a distribution hub and you can't unload the trailer fast enough to get it into a holding area to prepare for final mile delivery, and you end up, losing doses or something like that. What about damage? I mean, we know that there is damage to freight during shipment if you're not careful, if you don't follow the right processes.
James, you'd mentioned a couple of times that the majority of truckload carriers aren't really involved in vaccine distribution. So those of you that are watching this podcast or watching this video cast and listening to the podcast are probably thinking, none of this really affects me. But according to DAT's Freight Outlook, for a preparation of the post-pandemic world, there's going to be some changes with supply and demand. And markets are slowly going to start to rebalance themselves as vaccines become more widely available.
Yeah, that's right, Jason. And a few other folks we've talked to this week also mentioned the fact that as more vaccine loads come to market and the carriers who haul those loads are sort of diverting their resources away from, refrigerated loads of apples or early spring produce or, other goods that they might otherwise haul, there could be opportunities there for carriers who aren't hauling vaccine loads to pick up freight that might not otherwise have been available to them. You can read more on vaccine hauls at ccjdigital.com, and you can find the 1044 each week on CCJ's YouTube channel or in your favorite podcast listening app. If you've got questions, comments, criticisms, or feedback otherwise, we want to hear it. So hit us up at 1044trucking@gmail.com or give us a call at 404-491-1380. Until next week, everybody stay safe.